In a town where a woman's worth is counted in sons, a battered widow was dragged through the dirt for daring to birth twin girls. The men who beat her thought no one would care. But from the shadows stepped a mountain man, silent, scarred, and done watching cowards. "I will be their father," he said, lifting her up in front of the whole town. But behind that stand was a secret none of them saw. The widow's land holds the last spring in a dying valley, and the men who shamed her will do anything, lie, burn, kill, to seize it. As the church bell tolls and the line between justice and revenge blurs, one question hangs in the air, thick as gun smoke. When the law is a rope and a torch, who will stand for the woman, the water, and the two little girls born without a chance? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Ironwood Crossing's main street, dust swirling in eddies around the boots of townspeople who hurried past with averted eyes. The sharp crack of a hand striking flesh echoed from the saloon's wooden porch, followed by the piercing wails of two infant girls. Miriam LeClaire stumbled, her legs weak from childbirth as her brothers-in-law yanked her forward by the arms. Her dress was stained with the dust of the street, her face marked with tears and the red imprint of Elias LeClaire's hand. "You've brought nothing but shame to our family name," Elias spat, his face twisted with contempt. "Two girls? What good are daughters to carry on the LeClaire legacy?" Miriam tried to pull away, desperate to reach her crying babies in their basket. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They're innocent. They're your brother's children." Across the street, Ezekiel Brandt stood motionless in the shadow of the general store. His weathered hands tightened on his rifle strap as he watched the scene unfold. The townspeople scurried past like mice, keeping their heads down, unwilling to challenge the powerful LeClaire family. Another sharp crack split the air as Elias struck Miriam again. This time she fell to her knees, and the twins' cries grew more frantic. Something shifted in Ezekiel's expression. A hardening around his eyes, a tightening of his jaw. With deliberate steps, he crossed the dusty street. His spurs rang against the wooden planks as he mounted the saloon steps. The LeClaire brothers turned at the sound, their faces darkening at the interruption. "Step aside, mountain man," Elias growled. "This is family business." Ezekiel's voice came low and steady as summer thunder. "I reckon it's everybody's business when a man strikes a woman and frightens babies." He moved between them and Miriam, his broad shoulders blocking their reach. "These girls need a father," he continued, his words carrying across the now silent street. "I will be their father now." The declaration hung in the air like smoke. Elias's face reddened with rage, but before he could respond, Ezekiel had already turned away. With gentle hands that belied his rugged appearance, he helped Miriam to her feet. Then he lifted her in his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing, while somehow managing to secure the basket with the twins as well. The crowd that had gathered parted like water as Ezekiel carried his newfound family toward the whitewashed church at the end of the street. Behind them, Elias LeClaire's threats echoed off the building fronts, promises of vengeance and legal action that made the townsfolk shrink further into doorways. Inside the church's back room, as evening's shadows lengthened across the floor, Ezekiel dabbed at Miriam's cuts with a damp cloth. The twins slept nearby in their basket, finally peaceful. The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand and the scent of beeswax candles mixing with evening air through the open window. "You didn't have to do this," Miriam murmured, wincing as he cleaned a particularly tender spot. "They'll come after you now, too." Ezekiel's hands remained steady as he worked. "Ain't right what they did. Ain't Christian neither, treating their own kin that way." A soft knock at the door preceded Preacher Josiah Carter's entrance. His kind face was creased with worry as he closed the door behind him. "The LeClaire brothers just left my office," he said, his voice grave. "They're filing papers first thing tomorrow morning claiming Miriam's homestead should revert to the family since she had no male heir." Miriam's face went pale. "But that land was deeded to me and my children, not just to sons." My husband made sure of it before he passed." The preacher nodded slowly. "That he did. But the LeClairs have influence with Judge Morrison. They'll argue that without a man to work the land, you can't maintain it properly." "She won't be alone," Ezekiel said firmly, setting aside the cloth and standing to his full height. "I meant what I said out there. These little ones need a father, and Miriam needs someone to stand with her." Preacher Carter studied him thoughtfully. "You understand what you're taking on? The LeClairs won't let this go easily. They've got pride and greed driving them, and that's a dangerous combination." "I understand plenty." Ezekiel's voice was quiet but iron hard. "Sometimes a man's got to plant his feet and stand, don't matter how hard the wind blows." As if in response to his words, one of the twins stirred and whimpered. Miriam immediately went to the basket, her own pain forgotten as she soothed her daughter. The simple act of maternal love seemed to fill the small room with a different kind of strength. Not the brutal force of the LeClairs, but something deeper and more enduring. Morning light crept through the church's stained glass windows, painting soft colors across the worn wooden floor. Miriam sat in a straight-backed chair, one of the twins nestled against her chest while the other slept in a makeshift cradle nearby. Ezekiel stood by the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the dawn. "The spring runs year-round," Miriam explained, her voice barely above a whisper to avoid waking the sleeping infant. "Even in the driest summers, it never fails. That's why my husband chose that particular plot when we first came here." Ezekiel turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "And it feeds the town's water supply?" "Most of it." Miriam adjusted the nursing baby with gentle hands. "The creek that runs through Ironwood Crossing starts on our land. Without that spring, half the town would go dry by August." "Now I understand why your brothers-in-law are so set on taking it," Ezekiel said, his voice hardening. "They're aiming to control the whole town through that water." Miriam nodded, her face drawn with worry. They always resented that their younger brother had the best water rights in the territory. Now that he's gone, she trailed off, blinking back tears. "Listen here," Ezekiel said, crossing the room to kneel beside her chair. "I meant what I said yesterday. I'll help you fight for what's rightfully yours. Those girls deserve their inheritance, and no amount of legal tricks should change that." The door opened quietly and Preacher Carter stepped in, his face grave. "I've been hearing talk around town," he said, closing the door carefully behind him. "The LeClairs spent the night at Judge Morrison's house. They're stirring up trouble, claiming Miriam isn't fit to manage the property alone." The baby finished nursing and Miriam gently shifted her to her shoulder, patting her back. "What should we do?" "You could leave," the preacher suggested, though his tone suggested he knew the answer already. "Take the girls and start fresh somewhere else. There's plenty of territory where the LeClairs have no influence." "No." Ezekiel's response was immediate and firm. "Running won't solve this. Those men will just keep taking what isn't theirs, hurting whoever stands in their way." The baby let out a small burp and Miriam carefully laid her next to her sister in the cradle. "But where can we go for now? We can't stay in the church forever." "I've got a line shack up in the hills," Ezekiel said. "It's not much, but it's solid and defensible. We can stay there while we sort this out." The rest of the afternoon passed in careful preparation. Ezekiel borrowed a wagon from a sympathetic farmer on the outskirts of town, promising to return it within the week. They packed what little Miriam had brought with her, some clothes, basic supplies, and precious items she'd managed to grab before the LeClairs forced her out of her home. Preacher Carter helped them gather additional supplies, extra blankets, food staples, and a few tools they might need. He also provided them with a letter, officially documenting Miriam's state of mind and the circumstances of her departure from town, in case it was needed later. As dusk approached, they loaded the wagon. Ezekiel arranged straw and blankets in the back to make a comfortable nest for Miriam and the twins. The babies, seemingly sensing the tension in the air, remained unusually quiet. They left town just as the sun disappeared behind the western hills. The wagon creaked softly as they made their way along the old hunting trail that led into the mountains. Ezekiel handled the reins with practiced ease, choosing their path carefully to avoid the worst bumps and dips. Miriam sat in the back with her daughters, humming softly to keep them calm as the wagon swayed. The evening air grew cooler as they climbed higher into the hills, and she tucked the blankets more securely around the infants. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky when they finally reached Ezekiel's cabin. It was a sturdy structure built of thick logs, tucked into a natural clearing surrounded by pine trees. A small creek burbled nearby, and the sound of crickets filled the air. Ezekiel helped Miriam down from the wagon, then carefully lifted the basket containing the sleeping twins. The cabin door creaked slightly as he pushed it open, revealing a simple but clean interior. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while a narrow bed occupied another. Basic furniture, a table, 2 chairs, and some storage trunks completed the sparse furnishings. "It's not much," Ezekiel said, setting the basket down gently. "But it's safe, and it's yours for as long as you need it." Miriam looked around the small space, taking in the rough-hewn walls and the faint scent of pine smoke. "It's perfect," she whispered, and for the first time since the previous day's violence, her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you, Ezekiel, for everything." Dawn painted the mountain peaks in soft gold as Ezekiel stepped out onto the line shack's weathered porch. The old boards creaked under his boots as he surveyed the work ahead. Winter storms had loosened several roof shingles, and the north wall needed fresh chinking between the logs. He gathered his tools and set to work, the rhythmic sound of his hammer echoing through the morning air. Inside, Miriam moved slowly around the cabin's single room, still tender from childbirth. She had managed to sweep the floor and arrange their meager belongings, though each movement cost her effort. The twins lay bundled in their basket near the hearth, where a small fire kept the mountain chill at bay. One of the babies began to fuss, her tiny face scrunching up in distress. Miriam lifted her gently, but the infant's swaddling had come loose during the night. As she started to rewrap the blanket, Ezekiel stepped inside for his canteen. "Would you like to learn?" Miriam asked softly, noticing his curious glance. "It helps them feel safe, like they're still in the womb." Ezekiel hesitated, then set down his canteen. His large, calloused hands seemed out of place near the delicate infant, but he sat beside Miriam on the rough-hewn bench by the fire. "Like this," Miriam demonstrated, laying out a soft blanket in a diamond shape. "First, fold down the top corner." She placed the baby in the center, her head above the folded edge. "Now, take this side and wrap it across her chest, tucking it under her other arm." Ezekiel watched intently as Miriam's skilled hands completed the wrapping. "Your turn," she said, nodding toward the other twin who had begun to stir. With careful movements, Ezekiel spread out the second blanket. His first attempt was too loose, and Miriam guided his hands with gentle touches. "A little snugger," she encouraged. "They like to feel held tight." On his third try, the baby settled contentedly into the swaddling, her eyes drifting closed. A smile tugged at the corner of Ezekiel's mouth. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "That does work." By midday, the roof was patched and Ezekiel had started on the wall repairs. Miriam had insisted on helping despite her weakness, handing him tools and mixing the chinking compound of mud and grass. When it came time to fetch more water, Ezekiel insisted they both go, wanting Miriam to know the lay of the land. The spring bubbled up from between 2 rocks just east of the cabin, forming a clear pool before running down the mountainside. Ezekiel carried both water buckets, while Miriam cradled the twins against her chest in a sling she'd fashioned from a shawl. "This spring feeds 3 creeks," Ezekiel explained, setting down the buckets. "The eastern branch runs through your homestead, then down to Ironwood Crossing." He pointed toward the distant valley. "The Leclercs know these hills. They'll likely try to catch us off guard, maybe send men up through the back valley there." Miriam's arms tightened around her daughters. "What can we do?" "I've got friends among the trappers," Ezekiel said. "They'll warn us if strangers start asking questions. Meanwhile, we'll fortify what we can and keep watch." He filled the buckets with the crystal-clear water. "This high up we can see anyone approaching long before they reach us." That evening, after the twins were fed and sleeping, Miriam sat by the fire while Ezekiel cleaned his rifle. The cabin had grown more comfortable with their small touches. A borrowed quilt on the bed, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the twins' basket lined with soft blankets. "I never meant to bring such trouble to your door," Miriam said quietly, staring into the flames. "You had a peaceful life here before us." Ezekiel set aside his rifle. "Peace isn't worth much if it means turning away from what's right." He added another log to the fire. "I lost my own family years ago, wife and child both. Thought I'd live out my days alone up here." He met Miriam's gaze. Maybe the Lord had other plans. "But the Leclercs are just men," Ezekiel finished. "Bullies who've never been stood up to. Together we're stronger than they reckon." A coyote's howl echoed through the darkness, making Miriam jump. The twins stirred but didn't wake. Ezekiel moved to the window, checking that the shutters were secure. "Just letting his kin know where he is," Ezekiel explained, returning to his seat by the fire. "Nothing to fear from them this close to the cabin." Miriam nodded, gradually relaxing as the familiar sounds of the mountain night surrounded them. The pop of the fire, the whisper of wind in the pines, the soft breathing of her daughters. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt something close to peace. Ezekiel added a final log to the fire, settling in for the night watch. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, and in their warm light, this makeshift family found a moment of quiet grace in their shared sanctuary. The morning sun cast long shadows across the line shack's yard as Ezekiel split logs for the woodpile. His axe rose and fell in a steady rhythm, the sharp crack of splitting wood echoing off the mountainside. The physical labor helped clear his mind, letting him plan their next moves. A glint of light caught his eye. Pausing mid-swing, Ezekiel shaded his eyes and looked down the winding mountain road. A cloud of dust rose from 3 riders moving at a steady pace. Even at this distance, he recognized the Leclerc brothers' distinctive way of riding. Elias slouched in his saddle, while the 3rd rider's badge caught the sunlight. The town deputy. Ezekiel drove his axe into the chopping block and strode to the cabin. Inside, Miriam sat in the rocking chair, nursing one of the twins while the other slept nearby. "The Leclercs are coming," he said quietly, retrieving his rifle from above the door. "They're headed for your homestead with the deputy." He checked the ammunition, then handed the weapon to Miriam. "Stay inside, keep this close, I'm riding down to meet them." Miriam's face paled, but her hands were steady as she took the rifle. "Be careful," she whispered. Ezekiel saddled his horse with practiced efficiency, his movements quick but unhurried. He knew the mountain trails better than the Leclercs. He could reach the spring before they finished their climb to the homestead. The horse's hooves kicked up small stones as they descended the narrow path. Ezekiel guided his mount through a shortcut between 2 rocky outcrops, emerging near the spring that fed both his cabin and Miriam's homestead. He dismounted and ground-tied his horse in a cluster of aspens. Minutes later, hoofbeats announced the approaching riders. Ezekiel stepped out onto the path, blocking their way. The 3 men reined their horses to a stop, dust settling around them in the morning light. "That's far enough," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. Elias Leclerc's hand twitched toward his gun, but the deputy raised a restraining arm. "We're here on official business, Brant," the deputy said, his badge glinting. "The Leclerc family is claiming their rightful property." "That land belongs to Miriam Leclerc," Ezekiel replied evenly. "Her husband's deed is filed with the territory office." "A woman can't hold property without a male guardian," Elias spat. "Everyone knows that." "The law says different," Ezekiel countered. "And you know it." The deputy's smirk widened. "Laws can be interpreted many ways, Brant. We'll be back with a court order that makes things nice and legal." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day to you." The 3 men wheeled their horses around, but Elias lingered a moment longer, his face twisted with barely contained rage. "This ain't over," he growled before spurring his horse after the others. Ezekiel watched until they disappeared around the bend, then mounted and rode back to the cabin. Miriam met him on the porch, rifle still in hand, relief washing over her face as he approached. "They're gone for now," he said, dismounting. "But they'll be back with papers." The day passed tensely, both of them watching the road while going about their tasks. As evening approached, bringing long purple shadows across the yard, the sound of another horse approaching set them both on edge. But this rider came from the west, following an old game trail. Ezekiel relaxed slightly as he recognized the distinctive paint horse and its rider's familiar silhouette. "Henry," he called out in greeting as the man drew closer. "Been a while?" Henry Two Rivers dismounted smoothly, his weathered face creasing in a slight smile. The Ute scout was dressed in a mixture of tribal and settler clothing, his dark eyes sharp and observant as they took in the cabin and its occupants. "Trouble follows you like wolves follow buffalo, brother," Henry said, clasping Ezekiel's offered hand. His English was clear and precise, touched with dry humor. Ezekiel made introductions and Miriam brought out cups of coffee. They sat on the porch while Henry shared what he'd learned in town. "The Leclercs are spreading money like manure before planting," Henry said, warming his hands around his cup. "The judge, the land office clerk, even the territorial surveyor, all have been visited by Randall Leclerc with bulging pockets." He looked at Miriam. "They mean to take your land by paper if they cannot take it by force." "There must be something we can do," Miriam said, her voice tight with worry. Henry nodded slowly. "The white man's laws have many paths, like game trails in the mountains. Some lead to traps, others to safe passage." He turned to Ezekiel. "I have learned to walk these trails. If you trust me, I can help you find the right path." "I trust you with my life," Ezekiel replied without hesitation. "You know that." "Good." Henry set down his empty cup. "Because we will need trust and courage and wisdom to defeat men who think money can buy justice." The next morning dawned clear and cool, with a light breeze rustling through the aspen leaves. Ezekiel and Henry set out early, their horses' hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as they followed the winding trail down from the mountains. The territorial land office lay several miles to the east, a journey that would take most of the day. As they rode, Henry guided his paint horse closer to Ezekiel's mount. "This land," he said, gesturing to the rolling hills around them. "It was once all Ute hunting grounds. My grandfather taught me every stream, every spring." His voice carried no bitterness, only a deep knowing. "Now we watch settlers fight over pieces of paper that claim the water." Ezekiel nodded, understanding the weight of Henry's words. "Lost my own share of claims," he said quietly. "Back before." He trailed off, the memory of his wife and child still raw after all these years. "I remember," Henry said softly. "That winter was harsh on many." He adjusted his hat against the morning sun. "But water rights, they are different. The Ute people learned quickly. In this new world, the paper speaks louder than the truth of the land." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of their horses' steps matching the gentle wind. Henry shared stories of other water disputes he'd witnessed, of settlers who'd tried to divert streams from tribal lands, and of the careful dance between territorial law and ancient rights. "The Leclercs," Henry continued, "they are like many who came before. They see the land as something to own, not something to guard." He glanced at Ezekiel. "But you understand differently. That is why I help." The Territorial Agency office appeared ahead just past noon, a weathered wooden building with a small stable beside it. They dismounted, tied their horses, and stepped into the dim interior. The office smelled of dust and old paper with rows of filing cabinets lining the walls. An older clerk looked up from his desk, adjusting his spectacles. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Need to check a water rights deed," Ezekiel said, "for the Leclerc homestead near Ironwood Crossing." The clerk's expression shifted slightly at the name. "That's quite a few years of records to search through. Could take some time." Henry stepped forward, his presence calm but firm. "The deed would be under James Leclerc, filed 3 years ago, including water rights for the spring on the north property line." The clerk hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Let me see what I can find." They waited as the clerk searched through several drawers, finally pulling out a thick folder. His fingers moved carefully through the papers until he paused, drawing out a single document. "Here it is," he said quietly, laying it on the desk. "Filed properly, all right." James LeClaire registered the water rights in both his and his wife's names. He adjusted his spectacles again, studying the paper. By territorial law, that makes Mrs. LeClaire the legal holder now that her husband has passed. Ezekiel leaned forward, reading the carefully penned words that confirmed Miriam's claim to the spring. "We'll need a copy," he said. The clerk glanced at the door, then lowered his voice. "Town council meets next week. Present this there. It'll carry more weight with witnesses present." He began carefully copying the deed onto fresh paper. "But be careful. Word travels fast in these parts." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly. "The telegraph office next door." Ezekiel understood immediately. Someone would alert the LeClaires about their visit. They needed to move quickly. The clerk finished the copy, checking it against the original before handing it to Ezekiel. "Good luck," he said softly. "That spring serves more than just one family." Outside, as they mounted their horses, Henry pointed to movement in the telegraph office window. "We have perhaps 1 hour before the LeClaires know." "Then we'd best make good time," Ezekiel replied, securing the precious document inside his coat. They rode back at a steady pace, taking a different route than their morning journey. Henry led them through hidden valleys and along old game trails, paths that would be harder for anyone following to track. "You know what this means," Henry said as they rode. "The LeClaires will be desperate now. They know you have found the truth." Ezekiel nodded grimly. "Desperate men do desperate things. But truth like water finds its way out," Henry replied. "You have given Miriam back her voice. Now we must make sure it is heard." The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they made their way back toward the line shack, the copied deed safely tucked away, their horses moving steadily through the gathering dusk. Behind them, a telegraph operator's key clicked out a message to Ironwood Crossing, warning the LeClaire brothers that their scheme was about to be exposed. The setting sun painted long shadows across the weathered boards of Ezekiel's line shack as he dismounted, his boots crunching on dried pine needles. Inside, Miriam sat in the rickety rocking chair, one twin nestled against her chest while the other slept in a nest of blankets nearby. The cabin smelled of fresh bread and pine smoke, a warmth that eased the tension in his shoulders. "You found something," Miriam said softly, reading his expression in the fading light. Ezekiel nodded, carefully removing the copied deed from inside his coat. "Your husband," he said, settling onto a rough-hewn stool. "He did right by you, Miriam. Filed the water rights in both your names." Her hands trembled slightly as she took the document, eyes moving across the careful script. "James always said he'd make sure we were provided for," she whispered. "I never knew he'd done this." Henry stepped into the cabin, ducking his head beneath the low door frame. "The paper speaks clear," he said. "By law, the spring is yours now." Miriam looked up, her face set with quiet determination. "Then I must speak before the council. Show them the truth." They shared a simple supper of cornbread and beans, discussing how to present their case. The twins slept peacefully, their tiny breaths mixing with the crackle of the hearth fire. Ezekiel explained about the town council meeting scheduled for the following week. "It won't be easy," he warned, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "The LeClaires have friends there." "But they don't have the truth," Miriam replied, her voice stronger than he'd yet heard it. "I won't let them take my girl's inheritance. That spring belongs to their future." The next morning broke clear and cool. While Miriam nursed the twins, Ezekiel gathered tools and lumber from his lean-to. The babies needed proper beds, and working with his hands helped him think. The steady rhythm of saw and hammer filled the morning air as he constructed a simple cradle, large enough for both girls. Between his work, they practiced what Miriam would say to the council. Her voice grew steadier with each rehearsal, the words flowing more naturally as she spoke of James's wishes and her daughter's rights to their father's legacy. "Keep it simple," Ezekiel advised, smoothing rough edges from the cradle's rails. "Speak from your heart, but stand firm on the law." Henry prepared to leave just before noon, his paint horse stamping impatiently in the yard. "I know some ranchers," he said, adjusting his saddle straps. "Good men who remember how the Leclercs tried similar tricks before. They might stand with us." Ezekiel clasped his friend's arm. "Much obliged, Henry. Ride safe." As evening approached, Miriam's earlier confidence began to waver. She paced the small cabin, one twin in each arm, her face drawn with worry. "What if they won't listen?" she whispered. "What if I can't find the words?" Ezekiel looked up from where he was putting final touches on the cradle. Something stirred in his chest, a long-buried memory of his own wife's fears, of quiet evenings spent in prayer together. Before he could second-guess himself, he stood and gently took one of the twins from her arms. "My Sarah," he said softly. She always said prayer steadied her when nothing else would. He swallowed hard, the words feeling strange after so many silent years. Maybe we could pray together?" Miriam's eyes widened slightly, understanding the weight of what he offered. She nodded, and they sat together on the cabin's rough plank floor, the twins cradled between them. Ezekiel's voice was rough at first, unpracticed, but grew stronger as the words came back to him. He prayed for wisdom, for courage, for protection. For the first time since losing his family, the familiar words didn't taste like ashes in his mouth. When he finished, Miriam's own prayer rose soft but clear in the dim cabin. She prayed for her daughters, for strength to defend their birthright, for guidance to speak truth before power. Her words wrapped around them like a warm blanket, and Ezekiel felt something long frozen inside him begin to thaw. The twins slept peacefully in their new cradle that night, their tiny hands occasionally reaching for each other in sleep. Miriam sat in the rocking chair, watching them by lamplight, her face serene despite the challenges ahead. "I've been afraid," she admitted quietly. "Not just of the council, but of standing up at all, of making my voice heard." She looked at Ezekiel, who sat mending a bridle by the fire. "But these girls deserve a mother who fights for them, who shows them that truth matters more than fear." Ezekiel nodded, understanding. He'd seen that same resolve in Sarah years ago. It was the strength that grew not from fearlessness, but from choosing to act despite fear. "You won't stand alone," he promised, his hands steady on the leatherwork. "Whatever comes." Outside, a night bird called softly in the darkness, and the spring gurgled its endless song through the rocks. Inside the warm circle of lamplight, a fragile new family found its footing, preparing to face whatever the morning might bring. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Ezekiel hitched the wagon. The morning air held an autumn crispness that made the horse's breath steam. Miriam sat in the back, wrapped in quilts with the twins nestled close, while Henry rode alongside on his paint horse, alert for trouble. The road into Ironwood Crossing stretched before them like a dusty ribbon. Ezekiel handled the reins with careful attention, avoiding the worst ruts to spare Miriam and the babies any jarring. The slow journey gave him time to study her face in sidelong glances. Though still pale, her chin was set with determination. "Remember," Henry said as the first buildings came into view, "you speak with the authority of written law behind you." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect that brought a slight smile to Miriam's face. The town hall's weather-beaten facade loomed ahead, its steps already crowded with townspeople. Wagon wheels and boot heels had churned the street into pale powder that clung to everything. As Ezekiel brought the wagon to a halt, the crowd's chatter died away, replaced by whispers that rippled through the gathering like wind through dry grass. "Look at her, bold as brass on those poor babies. Ain't natural going against family." Ezekiel helped Miriam down from the wagon, steadying her as she cradled both twins. The small procession made their way up the wooden steps, boards creaking beneath their feet. Inside, the hall was packed shoulder to shoulder, the air already growing thick and close. Light filtered through dusty windows, catching motes that danced in the beams. The Leclerc brothers sat near the front, Randall in his Sunday best while Elias lounged with calculated insolence. Their faces wore identical smirks as Miriam and Ezekiel found seats near the back. Henry remained standing, his tall frame a quiet barrier between them and any trouble. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. "First order of business," he announced. "Petition regarding the LeClaire homestead water rights." Randall LeClaire rose smoothly, papers rustling in his manicured hands. "Honorable council members," he began, his voice oily with false sincerity. "We seek only to protect our family's interests. Our dear brother's widow, in her delicate condition, cannot properly manage such vital water rights. The spring serves the entire town. Surely you see the wisdom in transferring control to more capable hands." Murmurs of agreement rose from his supporters, mostly men who owed favors or money to the LeClaire family. Elias smirked wider, already tasting victory. "Mrs. LeClaire," Mayor Thompson called, "do you wish to respond?" Miriam stood slowly, passing one twin to Ezekiel while keeping the other close. Her plain dress and simple hair marked a stark contrast to the LeClaire's fancy attire. For a moment, her voice wavered. She swallowed hard, then lifted her chin. "I stand before you not just as James LeClaire's widow, but as a mother protecting her children's inheritance." The room grew still. Even the babies seemed to sense the importance of the moment, remaining quiet in their blankets. "My husband," her voice grew stronger, ringing clear to the rafters, "was a man who believed in doing things proper and legal. Before he died, he made sure our family would be provided for." She withdrew the water deed from her pocket, the paper crackling in the hushed room. "This deed, filed with the Territory Office, grants joint water rights to both James and myself. It bears his signature, the clerk's seal, and the date of filing." A stir went through the crowd. Women who had looked away before now watched with growing interest. Randall's smirk faltered as Miriam walked forward, presenting the document to Mayor Thompson. The mayor adjusted his spectacles, examining the deed carefully. "This appears to be in order," he said slowly. "The seal and signatures are genuine." "Impossible!" Elias burst out, half rising before Randall yanked him back down. "The law is clear," Miriam continued, her voice steady now. "These rights belong to me and my daughters. We ask only to keep what is legally ours." More whispers rippled through the crowd, but different now. Women nodded in approval. Several of the ranchers Henry had spoken to muttered their support. Even some of the council members who had seemed firmly in the LeClaire's pocket shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "Given the presentation of a valid deed, the council has no choice but to recognize Mrs. LeClaire's legal claim to the water rights." The LeClaire brothers' faces darkened like thunderclouds. Elias half rose again, but Randall's grip on his arm was white-knuckled. Their eyes promised this wasn't over. Ezekiel felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly as Miriam returned to her seat. She took her baby back, holding both twins close as scattered applause broke out among the townspeople. Several women stepped forward to offer quiet congratulations, while others shot pointed looks at the LeClaire brothers. Though victory tasted sweet, Ezekiel knew better than to celebrate too soon. He caught Henry's eye, seeing the same wary understanding there. They had won this skirmish, but the LeClaires weren't men to accept defeat gracefully. Still, watching Miriam accept her neighbor's good wishes with quiet dignity, Ezekiel felt that flicker of hope grow stronger. Sometimes, he reflected, the simple truth spoken clearly was the strongest weapon of all. Evening settled over Ironwood Crossing like a soft purple shawl. The town hall's double doors stood open, spilling lamplight onto the dusty street as townsfolk lingered to discuss the day's events. Several women had brought food to share, turning the council meeting's aftermath into an impromptu celebration. Ezekiel stood near the doorway, one shoulder against the weathered frame, watching the gathered crowd with careful eyes. Miriam sat inside at a rough-hewn table, accepting small gifts of food and kind words from neighbors who had ignored her just days before. The twins slept peacefully in a borrowed cradle, their tiny faces serene. "Best not risk the night road," Preacher Carter said quietly, appearing at Ezekiel's side. "My wife's already made up the spare room for Miriam and the little ones." Ezekiel nodded, grateful but tense. His years in the mountains had taught him that celebration often preceded danger. Through the gathering darkness, He could see the saloon's windows glowing like angry eyes. The LeClaire brothers had skulked away there after the meeting. "Much obliged, preacher," he said. "Reckon you're right about staying put tonight." Henry Two Rivers materialized from the shadows, his expression grave. "I'll keep watch," he said simply. "Something in the wind doesn't sit right." Inside the saloon, the LeClaire brothers nursed their wounds and their whiskey. Randall sat straight-backed at a corner table, his refined posture at odds with the murder in his eyes. Elias slouched beside him, already deep in his cups. "That deed weren't supposed to exist," Elias slurred. "You said you'd handled it." "Shut your fool mouth," Randall hissed, glancing around the nearly empty room. "There's more than one way to skin a cat." The brothers bent their heads together, their whispered plotting lost beneath the tinny piano music. Outside, the street grew quiet as townspeople drifted home. Only Henry remained, a shadow among shadows, watching. The preacher's home offered simple comfort, clean sheets, warm bread, and blessed quiet. Miriam settled the twins in a borrowed bassinet while Ezekiel checked every window and door. Sarah Carter, the preacher's wife, had made up pallets in the front room for the men. "The Lord provides," she said softly, bringing extra blankets. Her kind eyes held understanding of dangers left unspoken. Dawn brought no peace. Hoofbeats thundered down the street just as the first gray light touched the eastern sky. Ezekiel was on his feet before the riders' shouts split the morning. "Fire! The LeClaire place is burning!" The town erupted into motion. Men grabbed buckets while women herded children inside. Ezekiel and Henry exchanged sharp glances as Preacher Carter hurried to dress. "Apache Raiders!" Elias LeClaire's voice carried above the commotion. He rode hard down the street, his horse lathered with sweat. "Saw them myself, torched the homestead and rode north." Fear rippled through the gathering crowd. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men reached for weapons. The word Apache passed from lip to lip like poison. "Impossible," Henry muttered to Ezekiel. "No raids this far north in months, and Apache don't waste time burning empty buildings." But the damage was done. The LeClaire brothers played their parts perfectly, Randall organizing men to fight the fire, Elias stirring fears of savage attacks. By mid-morning, smoke still rose from the ruins of their homestead while terror rose in town. Inside the preacher's house, Miriam held her daughters close, face pale but composed. "They did this themselves," she said quietly. "To turn the town against us." Ezekiel nodded grimly. Already he could hear the whispers starting. How dangerous it was to have a woman and babies living so far out, how the spring might draw raiders, how the LeClaires had only tried to protect their own. "It's working too," Preacher Carter said heavily, watching through the window as armed men gathered in the street. "Fear's a powerful weapon, and they know how to wield it." The morning wore on, thick with tension. The LeClaire brothers rode back and forth through town, organizing patrols, speaking of tracks they'd found, stoking the flames of panic. Women who had celebrated with Miriam yesterday now hurried past the preacher's house with averted eyes. "They're cutting us off," Henry observed, his voice low, "using fear to isolate you before they strike again." Ezekiel's jaw tightened as he watched another group of townspeople scurry past, avoiding his gaze. The LeClaires had lost one battle but weren't finished fighting. They'd chosen their weapon well. Fear could turn neighbors into strangers faster than any deed or document could bind them together. Through the window, he could see Elias LeClaire holding court in front of the general store, gesturing dramatically as he recounted his tale of narrow escape. The gathering crowd hung on every word, their faces masks of terror and outrage. Randall stood slightly apart, his satisfied smile barely visible. Inside, Miriam rocked her daughters, her eyes meeting Ezekiel's with quiet determination. They had won the law, but now faced a different kind of battle, one fought with whispers instead of words, with fear instead of facts. The smoke from the LeClaire homestead drifted over town like a shroud, carrying with it the bitter scent of their enemy's latest scheme. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as Ezekiel and Henry approached the smoldering ruins of the LeClaire homestead. Smoke still curled from blackened timbers, and the acrid scent of burnt wood hung heavy in the air. They dismounted, letting their horses graze while they surveyed the scene. "Notice anything strange?" Henry asked, kneeling to examine marks in the dirt near what remained of the front door. Ezekiel's weathered face creased in concentration. "Boot prints, fresh ones." He traced the air above them with his finger. "And they're coming from inside the house, not toward it." Henry nodded, his expression grim. Whoever did this started the fire from within. No raiding party would bother going inside first. They worked methodically around the perimeter of the ruins, reading the story written in trampled grass and scattered debris. Behind the house, Ezekiel discovered an overturned kerosene can, its contents soaked into the earth. The metal was barely scorched, as if placed there after the flames had died down. "Look here," Henry called from the side of the house. He pointed to crude markings carved into a surviving fence post. "Supposed to look like Apache signs, I reckon. Except no Apache would make marks like these." He ran his fingers over the clumsy cuts. Whoever did this learned their Indian lore from penny novels. Ezekiel pulled his bandana up to cover his nose as they carefully picked through the still warm ruins. The fire had been thorough but selective, consuming the main house while leaving the barn untouched. More boot prints led to and from the back door, where a broken lamp lay shattered. "Staged," Ezekiel muttered. "Every bit of it." Back in town, Miriam sat in Sarah Carter's kitchen, watching through the window as armed men patrolled the streets. The twins slept nearby in their borrowed cradle, peaceful despite the tension gripping the town. Sarah worked quietly at the stove, preparing a noon meal neither woman felt much like eating. "I feel so useless," Miriam confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hiding here while others fight my battles." Sarah turned from her cooking, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're protecting your children," she said firmly. "There's nothing useless about that." Still, Miriam's hands twisted in her lap as the hours crawled by. Every shout from the street made her jump. Every shadow passing the window caused her heart to race. The twins stirred and fussed, sensing their mother's anxiety. The sun was low in the sky when Ezekiel and Henry finally returned. They slipped in through the back door of the preacher's house, their boots dusty and their faces grave. Preacher Carter joined them in the kitchen as they shared their findings. "Kerosene," Ezekiel reported quietly. "Broken lamp, boot prints leading out, not in. And those marks they claim are Apache?" He shook his head. "Crude work, meant to fool folks who wouldn't know better." "The fire was set from inside," Henry added. "Multiple points of origin. No raiding party would take that kind of time." Miriam listened intently, one hand resting protectively on the cradle. "But will it be enough?" she asked. "The town is terrified. They want to believe the Leclercs." "Sunday service," Preacher Carter said suddenly. All eyes turned to him. "Tomorrow morning. The whole town will be there, including the Leclercs. If we present the evidence then, with God's house as witness." He trailed off meaningfully. Ezekiel nodded slowly. Public accusation forced them to answer before the whole congregation. "We need something undeniable," Henry cautioned. "Something that will turn even their supporters against them." They gathered around Sarah's kitchen table, speaking in low voices as darkness fell outside. The twins slept on, unaware of the plans being laid for their future. Miriam found her voice growing stronger as they talked, her fear giving way to determination. "The kerosene can," she said. "It would have come from the general store. Mr. Patterson keeps records of every sale." "And the boot prints," Henry added. "I made sketches. They match the fancy Eastern boots Elias was wearing today." "We'll need witnesses," Preacher Carter mused. "Respected townspeople who can verify what you found." "The doctor," Sarah suggested. "And perhaps Mr. Patterson himself. Both are deacons, both respected." They worked late into the night, piecing together their case against the Leclercs. Each piece of evidence was examined, each potential witness considered carefully. The lamp fragments would be gathered, the boot prints photographed, the crude carvings documented. "It has to be perfect," Ezekiel said, his voice rough with fatigue. We only get one chance at this. Miriam reached across the table and squeezed his hand. It will be. God's truth has a way of coming to light. Outside, crickets chirped in the darkness, and a cool breeze carried away the last traces of smoke from the burnt homestead. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or ruin, but tonight they had hope and a plan. The LeClaire's own arrogance in staging such an obvious deception might prove their undoing. The Saturday morning dawned gray and heavy with approaching storm clouds. Ezekiel saddled his horse while Henry waited patiently atop his pinto pony. They had a long day ahead, gathering allies throughout Ironwood Crossing and the surrounding homesteads. Their first stop was Morgan's smithy. The blacksmith's muscled arms were coated in soot as he worked at his forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer echoing through the shop. He paused when the two men entered, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy cloth. "Heard about the homestead burning?" Morgan said, his voice gruff. "Also heard about those convenient Apache marks." He spat the word, making his skepticism clear. Ezekiel nodded. "We found proof it was staged, but we need folks willing to stand with us tomorrow at service." The blacksmith's hammer struck iron with particular force. "LeClaire's been charging double for every shoe since they took control of the freight contracts. Count me in." From the smithy, they rode to Patterson's general store. The bell tinkled as they entered, finding the owner tallying his ledger. Patterson's eyes darted nervously to the windows before he spoke. "Those kerosene sales you asked about?" He pulled out a different book from under the counter. "Elias LeClaire bought 3 cans Thursday morning, paid cash, which ain't his usual way." Henry smiled slowly. "Would you be willing to say that in church tomorrow?" Patterson straightened his spectacles. "My wife's been saying for years someone needs to stand up to those brothers. Might as well be now." The morning wore into afternoon as they rode from homestead to homestead. At the Miller Ranch, Mrs. Miller served them coffee while her husband spoke of grazing rights the LeClaire's had stolen through legal trickery. At the Cooper place, they heard how the brothers had diverted creek water from smaller farms to their own fields. "Time folks knew the truth," Cooper said, leaning on his fence post. "My family will be there tomorrow." Back in town, Miriam sat in Sarah Carter's parlor, trying to keep her hands steady as she mended one of her dresses. The twins slept nearby in their cradle, their peaceful faces giving her strength. But her fingers trembled at the thought of tomorrow's confrontation. Sarah brought her a cup of tea, settling into the chair opposite. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly. "Standing up for what's yours." Miriam nodded, though her throat felt tight. "I keep thinking of my James," she whispered. "He always said his brothers were dangerous men. I never understood how right he was until after he died." Thunder rumbled in the distance as Ezekiel and Henry made their final stops. The widow Carson, whose small ranch bordered LeClaire land, promised to bring her 3 grown sons. The Petersons, who had lost their best grazing meadow to the brothers' scheming, agreed to testify about falsified property lines. Storm clouds were rolling in earnest when they finally returned to the preacher's house. Wind whipped dust through the streets, and the first heavy drops began to fall as they stepped onto the porch. Miriam looked up from her sewing as they entered, her face drawn with worry. "How many?" she asked quietly. 15 families, Henry reported, removing his hat. "Plus Patterson, Morgan, and Doc Wilson. And every one of them has a story to tell about the LeClaire's true nature," Ezekiel added, moving to warm his hands by the fire. Lightning flashed outside, followed by a crack of thunder that made the windows rattle. The twins stirred but didn't wake, used now to the sounds of the storm. Miriam set aside her mending and walked to the window, watching rain stream down the glass. "What if it's not enough?" Her voice was barely audible above the storm. "What if they still find a way to—" "Miriam." Ezekiel's voice was gentle but firm. He crossed the room to stand beside her. "Our strength ain't in numbers or in fighting. It's in the truth, and in standing together." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm so tired of being afraid." "Then let others help carry that fear," he said. "Look how many are willing to stand with us. The LeClaire's ruled through fear and lies, but truth has a way of breaking chains." Thunder rolled again, but Miriam stood straighter, drawing strength from his words. The storm raged outside, but inside the preacher's house, a quiet determination settled over the group. They had gathered their allies, built their case piece by piece. Tomorrow would test their resolve, but tonight they took comfort in knowing they didn't stand alone. Sarah brought out a simple supper of bread and stew, and they ate together, planning the morning's testimony. Henry sketched out the order of witnesses, while Preacher Carter worked on his sermon. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, nature's own testimony to the power of persistence. "Get some rest," Ezekiel told Miriam as the evening grew late. "Tomorrow needs clear heads and steady hearts." She nodded, gathering the sleeping twins close. Despite her exhaustion, there was a new strength in her movements, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. The coalition they had built today wasn't just about stopping the Leclercs. It was about restoring justice to a town that had forgotten its own courage. The Sunday morning sun pierced through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the packed pews of Ironwood Crossings Church. The usual whispers and rustling of Sunday best clothes fell silent as Preacher Carter took his place at the pulpit, his weathered Bible open before him. "Today," he began, his voice carrying to the rafters, "we speak of justice and mercy, two virtues that, like reins on a horse, must work in balance." His eyes swept the congregation, lingering briefly on the Leclerc brothers who sat stiffly in their usual front pew. "The good book tells us that truth will out, like water finding its path downstream." Miriam sat near the back, cradling one of the twins while the other slept peacefully in a wooden cradle beside her. Ezekiel stood nearby, a leather satchel at his feet. Henry Two Rivers leaned against the wall near the door, his presence drawing uncertain glances from some of the townspeople. As the sermon drew to a close, Ezekiel stepped forward. "Preacher," he said, his voice clear and steady, "we bring evidence before God's house today." He reached into his satchel, producing charred wooden debris. The congregation stirred as he laid the pieces on a clean cloth before the altar. "These came from the Leclerc homestead," he continued. "Look here." He pointed to distinct boot prints pressed into the scorched wood, made by custom boots with a star pattern on the heel, the same pattern Elias Leclerc's boots leave in the dust outside Morgan's smithy. Elias Leclerc surged to his feet. "You dare bring lies into God's house?" Henry stepped forward, his movements deliberate. "No lies here." He lifted one piece of wood. "These supposed Apache marks? Wrong style, wrong depth, made by someone trying to imitate what they think our people's signs look like." His quiet authority silenced the murmurs. Miriam rose slowly, her baby clutched close. "My husband James warned me about his brothers before he died." Her voice trembled but grew stronger. "He knew what they were capable of." "She's nothing but a burden on our family name," Randall Leclerc shouted, but his words were drowned out as Patterson, the store owner, stood up. "3 cans of kerosene," Patterson declared, "bought by Elias himself the morning before the fire." Like a dam breaking, others began to rise. The widow Carson spoke of threatened water rights. The Petersons testified about falsified property lines. Morgan, the blacksmith, detailed years of price gouging. One by one, the truth emerged, each voice stronger than the last. The Leclerc brothers tried to shout them down, but their protests grew weaker as more townspeople stood. The truth, long buried under fear and manipulation, finally saw the light of God's house. The afternoon sun beat down on Ironwood Crossings Town Hall as citizens packed the emergency council session. Dust motes danced in shafts of light through the windows while councilmen shuffled papers at their long table, looking anywhere but at the disgraced Leclerc brothers. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat. "Given the evidence presented this morning at the church and the subsequent testimonies, this council moves to address the petition regarding the Leclerc water rights claim." He paused, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "All those in favor of revoking said petition, raise your hand." Every council member's hand rose. Even those who had once cowered under the Leclerc's influence now stood firm, bolstered by the weight of public sentiment filling the room. "Furthermore," the mayor continued, This council officially recognizes Mrs. Miriam Leclerc's legal claim to both land and water rights, as documented in the deed presented by Mr. Brandt. He turned to where Miriam sat, one of the twins sleeping against her shoulder. "Your late husband's wishes stand, ma'am. That water belongs to your homestead." Ezekiel, standing behind Miriam's chair, noticed how her shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. The burden of uncertainty lifted from her like a heavy wool blanket on a summer's day. As for the Leclerc brothers, Mayor Thompson's voice hardened. This council moves to levy fines for the arson and deception, totaling $500 each. Gasps rippled through the crowd at the substantial sum. Additionally, both Randall and Elias Leclerc are hereby stripped of their council seats, effective immediately. Elias lurched to his feet, face red with rage, but Randall grabbed his arm, pulling him back down. The younger brother's fury couldn't hide their defeat. That evening, sitting in Preacher Carter's parlor, Ezekiel watched Miriam rock both twins near the fireplace. The soft crackle of burning wood mixed with her gentle humming, creating a peace he hadn't felt since losing his own family years ago. "You've done right by them," Preacher Carter said quietly, joining Ezekiel by the window. "By all of them." Ezekiel nodded, feeling something shift inside his chest. The emptiness that had driven him to the mountains, to solitude, was filling with something new. Or perhaps something old, remembered. The warmth of family, the purpose of protecting those who needed him. One of the twins cooed, and Miriam looked up, catching his eye. Her smile, tired but genuine, reflected the same truth he felt. Sometimes family wasn't about blood at all, but about choosing to stand together when the world turned harsh. The days following the council's decision brought new life to Miriam's homestead. Women from Ironwood Crossing arrived each morning, aprons tied and sleeves rolled up, ready to wash windows, hang curtains, and breathe warmth back into the neglected rooms. The thump of hammers and rasp of saws filled the air as men repaired weathered boards and patched the leaking roof. Ezekiel stood in the yard, directing the volunteer work crew with quiet authority. "That beam needs extra support," he called to two ranchers wrestling with a porch post. His experienced eye caught every detail, ensuring the house would stand strong against whatever storms might come. Henry Two Rivers rode up one morning, dust coating his buckskins, carrying papers from the territorial office. "First steps for the adoption," he explained, handing them to Ezekiel. "Judge Wilson in Cedar Springs says he'll help expedite things given the circumstances." Ezekiel nodded, grateful for his friend's persistence. "Much obliged, Henry. You've done more than most would." "The little ones deserve a proper father," Henry replied with a knowing smile. "Someone who chose them, not just inherited them." Inside the house, Miriam had transformed the front room into a makeshift schoolroom. 5 ranch children sat cross-legged on a braided rug, while she pointed to letters chalked on a slate board. The twins lay nearby in their cradle, cooing at the sound of their mother's voice. "And what sound does B make?" Miriam asked, her gentle tone carrying the warmth that had drawn neighboring families to trust her with their children's education. "Bear!" shouted little Tommy Jenkins, making everyone laugh. "That's right," Miriam smiled. "Just like the bear Mr. Brandt scared away from your pa's sheep last week." The days settled into a rhythm of purpose and healing. Ezekiel found himself lingering longer each evening, reluctant to leave after the work was done. He'd watch Miriam rock the twins, her soft hymns drifting through the twilight, and feel an ache he thought long buried stir in his chest. One particular evening, as summer's heat gave way to autumn's first cool breath, Ezekiel and Miriam sat together on the newly built porch. The twins slept peacefully inside while crickets chirped their evening chorus. Henry's adoption papers lay signed on the table inside, waiting to be filed. Miriam's hands were busy with mending, but her movements slowed as she noticed Ezekiel's thoughtful silence. The man who had stepped between her and harm that day in town seemed different now, softer around the edges, yet somehow stronger too. "Reckon this place is coming along fine," Ezekiel said finally, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. "The garden's taking root, schoolrooms full of young'uns learning their letters." "Thanks to you," Miriam replied softly. "We wouldn't have any of this if you hadn't stood up that day." Ezekiel turned to face her, his weathered features earnest in the fading light. Been thinking on that day, Miriam, about choices and such. He paused, gathering courage. When I said I'd be their father, it wasn't just words to scare off those Leclercs. Something in me came alive again, something I thought died with my Sarah and little James. Miriam's hands stilled in her lap, her heart beating faster as Ezekiel continued. These past weeks, watching you with the girls, teaching those children, making this place a real home again. He took a deep breath. I'd like to stay, Miriam. Not just as their guardian, but as your partner. In life, in all of it, if you'll have me. The crickets seemed to hush as Miriam looked into his eyes, seeing not just the fierce protector who had saved her family, but a man offering his heart with the same quiet strength he'd shown that first day. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken understanding. The porch boards creaked softly as Ezekiel shifted, waiting for her answer, while somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called to its mate. The church bells of Ironwood Crossing rang clear and bright on the autumn morning. Inside, morning light streamed through dusty windows, casting warm patterns across the wooden pews where townsfolk gathered not out of duty, but genuine joy. Ezekiel stood before the altar, his usual buckskins replaced with a clean black coat. Henry Two Rivers stood proudly beside him as witness, his presence a bridge between two worlds. The territorial judge had made the journey from Cedar Springs, his formal documents spread carefully on the pulpit. Miriam approached with a twin in each arm, their tiny faces peeking out from hand-sewn christening gowns. She placed them gently in Ezekiel's waiting arms, and for a moment, the gruff mountain man's eyes glistened. Do you, Ezekiel Brandt, willingly take these children as your own? To raise, protect, and nurture as a father should? The judge asked solemnly. Ezekiel's voice carried clear and strong through the church. I do. I will be their father. He looked down at the sleeping infants. I am their father now. The signing of papers seemed a mere formality compared to the weight of that promise. Henry added his signature as witness, his usually stoic face brightening with a rare smile. The congregation burst into genuine applause, led by the women who had helped rebuild the homestead and the men who had stood against the Leclercs. Later, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and purple, the new family stood together by the spring that had sparked so much strife. Water bubbled clear and constant over sun-warmed rocks, no longer a source of division but a symbol of life renewed. Ezekiel cradled one twin while Miriam held the other, their small forms wrapped snug against the evening chill. Family ain't just about blood, he said softly, watching the water flow. It's about choosing to stand together come what may, about having the courage to love again. Miriam's free hand found his, their fingers intertwining naturally. Together, they turned toward home, walking the path they had defended so fiercely. Above them stretched the vast western sky, stars beginning to twinkle like promises kept, while behind them the spring continued its eternal song of life and renewal. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.